Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about teaching content and language together. So when I was a young student learning French in Canada, this is how we would often learn. What you see here is a ice hockey game, and that little black thing, do you know what it is? The ice hockey is popular in Canada, but not everywhere I know. This is a puck, a hockey puck. But when I went to school, we weren't allowed to call it a puck. I was an English Canadian. I spoke English at home. I spoke English with my family. I lived in an English neighborhood, but I went to French school. We had to call this a rondelle de hockey, a hockey washer, a hockey round thing. Or sometimes we preferred to call it, because the best hockey players and the coolest hockey players were French, and a form of French slang, they would call it this. Can you pronounce this word? This is caoutchouc, rubber. So we would call it the rubber, like the cool French guys did. And we weren't allowed to say, pass me the puck. We had to say, passe-moi le caoutchouc, like that. We didn't care, because we wanted to play hockey. What we were doing is learning the language, caoutchouc, rondelle de hockey, as well as learning the content, which in this case was our PE class, our physical education class. But it was the same in mathematics and geography and everything else, right? We had to say, if we said 2 plus 2 is 4, the teacher would say, non, c'est pas ça, and you had to say, 2 plus 2 égale 4, right? We had to speak French. So we were learning French while learning the various subjects, the content of our classes. This is now known as CLIL, right? Content and Language Integrated Learning. A related term is Content-Based Instruction, CBI. I'll briefly outline the two of them here, then I'll just stick with using the term CLIL for reasons that you'll see, right? So CLIL is where you have the teacher, like in my case, one teacher was teaching you the subject, the maths teacher was teaching us the subject, but she or he was also teaching us in French in order to teach us French at the same time. So he or she also knew how to teach French, was also a fluent French speaker. In my case, most of them were native French speakers from Quebec, sometimes from parts of Africa, sometimes from France. They were fluent or native speakers of French who knew enough about French to teach it, but also knew about the topic that they were teaching. And this is well known in Canada, and also it's common in some parts of Europe. Content-based instruction is similar in that the students are learning the content and the language, but they have two teachers. You have the subject teacher who's teaching you mathematics or science or phys ed, and you have a language teacher who's there at the same time. So it's team teaching with two teachers. This is more common only really in the United States, and even there it's not universal. It's, as you might guess, having two teachers is more logistically demanding and more expensive. And so it's not often as common. Of course, in some ways it's easier to use CBI with two teachers because each teacher can be a specialist in her or his subject. One can be a language specialist and the other can be a content specialist. In the CLIL format, you need a teacher who's good at teaching both language and teaching the topic, teaching history, teaching literature, what have you, right? So that can be very challenging to find teachers who are qualified and good at teaching both. For the most part, I'll just use the term CLIL to represent this idea of teaching content and language at the same time, instead of a general English class which focuses primarily just on learning English, or whatever other language, of course. So, the principles of CLIL are that, or both approaches, but as I said, I'll just use CLIL, is that we're using the target language, which in my case was French, in your case it might be teaching English, whatever language. The target language is being used to learn the topic, to learn about hockey, to learn about mathematics, and it's also the language that's being used to communicate about other things. So we talked about mathematics in French, But we would also talk about, what do you got for your lunch? We were to talk about that in French. And we were to ask the teacher, may I go to the bathroom in French? And we were to say, I need to sharpen my pencil in French. So French was the language of the classroom for all interaction, not just to talk about the topic. This is a key principle of CLIL. You're trying to create a target language environment where the target language is associated with the topic, but also just with the daily activities of being a student in a school. The subject determines the necessary target language. The target language is focused. This is not like those textbooks that you sometimes see where one sentence is about penguins and the next sentence is about, do you like to play tennis? And the next sentence is about how someone likes to cook pizzas or whatever, and it's all decontextualized. There's no organization to the content, or the organization is page level, right? One page is about recycling, the next page is about surfing, and so on, right? Here you've got the focus that the subject determines the target language. And so sometimes that target language will be quite specific. In geography, if you were teaching geography in English to non-native English speakers, you would have probably words like this, mountain, valley, and map, which can be useful, right? You may think mountain and valley are quite specialized, and they are in some ways, and map, but I can remember using map, for example, as a child, coloring in a map. You also then end up learning words for colors because the water is blue and the mountain ranges are brown and the forests are green and so on. So it's not that you're just learning these specific words, but they provide a focus for learning an expanded semantic field of related words. Then also sometimes you have, like in the case of mathematics, where you're learning words like add and plus and together. Well, these are useful for mathematics, but of course they're also very productive in many other things, right? It's not just that 2 and 2 together makes 4, but we use together, walk together, right? And all those other things, and many uses of add and plus that aren't really related to mathematical addition of numbers. So the learning of the topic is important. Students learn about geography and mathematics. They learn language related to those topics, but the language can also be very useful and productive in other topics, for discussing other topics, and for just existing as a speaker of the language who's not necessarily focused on learning. CLIL as a term originates in the 1990s. It's not to say that people wouldn't have done this beforehand, of course, but the term comes from the 1990s. We had traditional grammar translation for teaching of English, or teaching of language really, where you would have the target language material and you would translate it into whatever your home language was, right? Primarily it would be Latin. Or at least Latin in England, right? Students would read Latin, translate it into English. Later, for reasons that we discuss in a different part of this module, this is superseded, taken over by CLT, communicative language teaching. Communicative language teaching, as it says in the name, was focused on communication, right? More talking and listening was done, but the content wasn't necessarily prioritized. So teachers would just think of topics that seemed interesting to the students and use those to teach them the language. CLIL, the focus is on particular content. As it says here in this quotation, right, it's dual focused, because you're not just using arbitrary content to teach language, you're using specific content to teach that content, and the content matters. Students will be tested on their knowledge of French. Students learning French by reading sentences about whatever I said before, penguins and playing tennis, students learning that way do not get tested on their knowledge of penguins and their knowledge of tennis. Students learning in a CLIL approach will be tested on their knowledge of mathematics and their knowledge of geography and their knowledge of history and so on, as well as their knowledge of English or French or whatever the target language is. That's what's meant by dual focus. They both matter equally in terms of student achievement, student progress. there can be a continuum, right? Some classes, some individual lessons, some schools, some education systems may be focused more on the content end. Some may be more focused at the language end of the continuum, or anywhere between. Some may be quite balanced, as was the case for French students of French in Canada learning at the time that I did. I should reiterate here, as I think I've done now, of course my focus is on talking about English because this is a TESOL course, but that's not to say that any of this couldn't apply in other contexts. And in fact, I'll give you right now an example from CNAWS 2015 that illustrates the complexity of this. I think this is very interesting for those of us who, if you went to a monolingual school system, learned in your language primarily, and only learned another language in language class, you might not realize how much diversity there is in the world in terms of how language interacts with content-based instruction. So the example here is a secondary school in the Basque country in Spain, where the primary language of the whole region is Basque, right? Spain, primarily, you might think Spanish, but in the Basque region, primarily Basque language. But then within the Basque country area, it was a Spanish-speaking locale. So these students are in a Spanish area, within a Basque area, within a Spanish area, within a world that's dominated by English in many ways. How does their school try to prepare them for existence like this, right? Most of the students, Spanish is their first language. Spanish is their L1. They studied mathematics and science in Spanish. They studied technology and phys ed in Basque, and they studied in English, social science, and their English language classes. So they have a real integration of topics, right? You'll notice that all of the topics are spread across the languages, an integration of topic and language, and they were tested on their knowledge of language, but also on their knowledge of these topics. This is the kind of thing that you'll see. Now, this is probably more complex than you'd see in most cases, but it does exist, situations like this. In Canada, this extreme of at the extreme end that I described for my learning, extreme in the sense that it was entirely in French. This is a form of CLIL, though, called immersion, right? So we were English Canadians in the sense that our parents spoke English, we lived in English neighborhoods, most of our friends were native English speakers. We were English Canadians, but we could go to a school where we would be immersed in French. So French, the L2, was the medium of instruction, but we had the same curriculum as students who were going to English schools. We had to learn the same things, but we had to learn them in French. And there was support for English. They wanted to make sure that we learned English too, but of course they knew that we would naturally acquire English by living in English-speaking areas with English-speaking families, right? But there was support for English. But they wanted to add on a second language. Additive bilingualism means adding on French. Subtractive bilingualism, although in practice you wouldn't want to do it, but the phenomenon of subtractive bilingualism does happen often it can be the case with immigrants, especially young immigrants coming to a country with their own L1 from wherever they originate from. They come to, say, England and learn English and become bilingual, but in a way that their first language is not maintained well. It's still there, but disappears almost entirely or becomes very weak, right? No, immersion programs and CLIL more generally, of which an immersion program is one type, aim for additive bilingualism. Of course, we mostly got our French in the classroom and in the schoolyard. We started at a similar level with very little French because we were English, but our teachers were bilingual and were proficient in French and in teaching the content. And finally, one point of interest is that we were supposed to follow the classroom culture of French. And so that would be anything from, like I said, interacting with day-to-day things, pass me a pencil was supposed to be in French, as well as following French cultural practices that we learned from our teachers, our French Canadian teachers, those teachers from France, and some of those teachers, as I said, from Africa. We were supposed to learn about their cultures, their classroom cultures, which in a small way was supposed to enculturate us in knowing more about their cultures generally, so that we would not only learn their language, but learn to appreciate their cultures as well. That is one of the purposes of immersion specifically, or CLIL more generally, that you learn an appreciation of the lingua culture, the language and the culture. So the aim of CLIL is to acquire subject knowledge, content knowledge. When I say subject or content, I mean the same thing. To acquire content knowledge using the target language, to have the necessary transferable language skills in the target language that we can learn. But I'm learning French and I'm learning words like noun and verb in French, but that I can apply those to English as well, so that I don't lose my first language, so that my bilingualism is in fact additive. We want the students to gain all the benefits that they would learn from education generally, right? Students learning in their L1 develop cognitive and social skills, problem solving, empathetic relationships, using language to be positive or to hedge in order to show some tentativeness and so on. We want them to learn all of that in their L2 the same way that they would have learned it in their L1, and we want them to understand and value both cultures. And this does seem to happen. For example, in the case of Canada, where students who are English and go to French schools, or vice versa, Francophone French Canadians who go to English schools do tend to have more positive opinions about members of the other culture. So CLIL does, it's an aim of CLIL, and it does tend to happen, that people learning a language through content do tend to be more positive about that culture as well. Now, there are problems for students that you can probably imagine. We're going to list them, but you could probably imagine them anyway. Imagine being especially a young student who's new to the CLIL classroom. You have to listen and understand the teachers talking about subjects, right? They're not just talking about, hi, how are you, and open your book, some of which can be very easy, right? Okay, open your book with the gesture, students would understand it, right? Turn to page 3, turn 1, 2, 3. You can act out a lot of that stuff to make it understandable. But then the students have to listen to the teachers talk about the subjects. It can be very difficult. The teachers, in effect, become these strange, I read them once described as these strange beings who understand 2 languages but only respond in one, right? Imagine we are students in another country learning English via the CLIL approach. We might sometimes be able to speak in English to our teacher. We might sometimes have to speak our L1. The teacher will hear and understand, but will still respond only in English the most of the time, right? So the teachers have to be quite adept at this, right? At being clear and easily understood in the L1, despite the fact that students, in the L2, in the target language, despite the fact that students may talk to them in their first language. It can be very difficult for students. They have to know the topic, they have to use the social language, right? They have to learn to talk to their friends and their teachers, not just about the content, but about those day-to-day interactions, right? Oh, you've got a sandwich and I've got a plum, do you want to switch, or something like that, right? Whatever it is kids talk about in school. And they have to talk to the subjects to each other, not just to the teacher. And the teacher, of course, knows the subject inside out, so she or he will be able to understand things even if the language is not perfectly communicative. Talking to another student who doesn't know the topic and who doesn't know the language can be very challenging, right? 2 people who only partially know the subject and the topic have to work very hard to understand each other, which may be some of the reason for the actual success of CLIL and of, more specifically, immersion, because it forces students to use the language so much. And of course, the students have to learn to read. right? Learn to read subject textbooks. So they're not reading just comic books or adventure stories or things that maybe bring them more joy than reading a textbook. They have to read the textbooks too. It can be very challenging. And they have to write, right? The most difficult part of all is that they then have to write this down, right? Lots of challenges for students. There are ways that are suggested for giving support, right? You've got to take more time for listening to teach the vocabulary explicitly. With learning new vocabulary in your first language, you often hear a word. How many words that you know did you actually look up in the dictionary? No, you hear the word and it's said within a certain co-text, right? There are other words around it, and it's said in a certain context, in a certain place, at a certain time, with certain people, and you're able to deduce the meaning of the word without looking it up. In an L2, learning an L2, that doesn't happen, right? Or it can, but not as much, right? If you want to support your students listening, you have to say words. When you say a word that's new or that you think is new, you may have to gloss the word, give a brief definition, right? At the level of, that's for the individual words. At the text level, you want to use visuals, right? Give students pictures to work with, have realia, have items that they can look at while they're learning things. Starting with familiar genres is good, right? If students know that a typical story involves a certain process, right? That there'll be, typically there's a state of affairs at the start that's quite normal, then something happens to change things, you know, the villain appears or there's a big storm or whatever, and then the action gets more and more intense, and so on through the progress of a typical genre narrative. Well, then giving students similar genres but in the target language will make it easier for them to understand what's going on. You've got to adjust the teacher talking style to be more redundant. You've got to repeat yourself more often, right? More of that enumerating. I have 3 points. The first point is, now the second point is, now I'm going to give you the third point, but the first, don't forget, the first and the second were this and this, and so on. You've got to do more of that, more exemplification, more explanation, more summarization, to the extent that you may even feel silly doing it. You may seem like you're overdoing it, but that's the kind of thing you've got to do when you're teaching both the language and the content. And we could say similar things for supporting speaking. You want to gently lead the students in by asking them easy questions, or the more difficult questions should be just short answers, right? You want to prompt responses, right? By, for example, giving the students the start of the answer. What are your hobbies? My hobby is, give them something to repeat in order to start. Or I like to, give them some options, right? Give them the vocabulary to work with. And as I said before, you're going to have to get used to hearing the L1 responses, but then you can recast them into French, right? You can tell the student how he or she could say it in French, or sorry, in whatever language it is, not necessarily French. Support for reading, vocabulary checks, right, beforehand, pre-reading questions, right? What do you think will happen in this case? What would you do if? That sort of thing that can get them prepped for what's to come. You can have charts and gap fills where they fill things in order to check their reading as they go. Don't get them to read the whole story and then answer questions. I have things that they can do progressively, read this, answer that, read this, answer that, that should help them as they go along. Finally, with writing, vocabulary lists of possible words to use in their answers, sentence starters, like I said before, the sort of thing where you say, on Monday, I like to, and then they continue from that point. It gives them a model to work with. Writing frames, like with the genres, expectations of what would happen. You know, a news story will typically start with, at the top level, the most important information. Then there will typically be someone interviewed who is affected by whatever happened and so on. So a writing frame can help with that kind of thing. and let them talk, right? Support for writing in an L1 classroom if English students are writing in English, they're probably expected to be quiet to allow the other students to do their writing and think. In a CLIL classroom, you're probably doing something different. You're probably encouraging them to talk while they write so they can talk through their ideas, practice the words, practice the grammar and so on before they write, but while they write. So it may be quite a different experience. So lots of different ways to support our students in a CLIL classroom. Here's something to think about while you're doing your research and reading on this topic. What might be some of the obstacles for CLIL teachers? I've named a couple. You can probably think of more. Imagine your next teaching job is in a secondary school. You're going to be teaching your degree subject if you did an undergraduate degree in a subject. If not, just pick one, right? You're going to be using EMI English as the medium of instruction, right? So you're teaching your degree subject in English to students for whom English is not the first language. How are you going to do it, right? They're going to learn geography. They've got to learn English. What are some of the strategies you can use to do that? Thank you very much. Bye.